Worldwide military spending is at its highest for 10 years. Where is all that money going? And might governments change their priorities as the coronavirus spreads? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Now, it's often said that war is good for business. Conflicts drive up demand for weapons, defence equipment and soldiers. And it appears last year was a bumper year. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute says global military spending grew to nearly $2 trillion. That's a more than 7% increase over 10 years. But that trend may change as the coronavirus pandemic devastates the world's economies. 5 countries account for more than 60% of the world's military expenditure. The US is by far the world's largest spender at $732 billion. That's more than a third of the global military budget. China's in second place at $261 billion, up 5% from 2018. India is third at $71 billion. It's the first time 2 Asian nations are among the top 3. Then it's Russia and Saudi Arabia, despite a 16% decrease in spending compared to 2018. Germany's defence budget rose by 10% to $49 billion, the biggest increase among the world's top 15 military spenders. Let's bring in our guests. From Sweden's capital, we have Pieter Wezeman. He's the senior researcher of the Arms and Military Expenditure Programme at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. From Leipzig in Germany, Adam Nee, director of the Australia-based China Policy Centre. And from Glasgow in the UK, Andrew Smith, spokesman for the campaign against the arms trade. Thank you all for joining us. Pieter, to you first of all, do you see a main driver in this increase in spending?
The increase in spending is driven by a wide variety of causes, depending on region to region, on country to country. But of course, as the United States is by far the largest military spender in the world, it's always important to look there. And there I think we can say that the Trump administration in particular is really seeing a return to the great power rivalries of the past and believes that military spending, military capability is an important foreign policy tool there. And of course we see something similar in China. There it is not so much a return to being a very large spender, but to actually having an economy that has growth over many years to the point that they can actually now be the second largest military spender in the world and leaving the others, except for the US, of course, far behind them. So very different reasons, but still kind of connected. And then, of course, we look elsewhere in the world. In Europe, we see a perceived threat from Russia, which has driven military spending increases in, for example, Germany. And in the Middle East, we see a number of wars and conflicts ongoing, and of course also the rise and fall of IS, which all have contributed to military spending in that part of the world.
Adam, your focus of interest is China. What is the driver you see for their increase in spending?
Right, certainly Xi's aim is to rejuvenate the Chinese nation, so that's the way he puts it. And military hard power is a very important element of that. Because I think in the view of Beijing, soft power, economic power, and its status in the world is underpinned by a variety of different kinds of power combinations, and hard power underlay all of that. So as a result, China's been increasing its military spending for a number of decades now. So notwithstanding the overall and unprecedented increase in global defense spending, with China in particularly, the new report shows 5% increase in defense spending, which is actually relatively low when you look at it compared to official Chinese figure, which in recent years range from 6, 7 to 8%. coming off actually double-digit growth for a number of years. But I think in the long run, Chinese military spending will probably trend towards GDP, and that is around 66% rather, before the outbreak of COVID-19. But I think essentially China believes that hard power is extremely useful and imperative to its increasing stature in the world and its strategic ambitions around the world.
Andrew, Donald Trump then likes all things military, and Adam there says that China sees a benefit in increasing its hard power. What drivers do you see for this increase in military spending?
Ultimately, I think ego and desire for power are very large parts of the equation, particularly in the United States, where it's a general election year this year. It's no surprise that Donald Trump is ramping up military spending as part of his America First agenda, his pitch to the electorate. But I think wherever we see war and conflict, wherever we see regional instability, there will always be arms companies who are looking to profit from it. The transfer of arms also fuels these conflicts in turn. If we take a look at the ongoing conflict in Yemen, for example, which has created the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, it is a war which has only been possible because of the sale of arms from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from other arms exporting governments. So these weapons aren't doing anything to make the people of Yemen any safer. In fact, they've created the worst humanitarian catastrophe anywhere in the world. And I think what COVID-19 has shown is how interdependent our security really is. And that will hopefully cause some reflection, a pause in the ever greater militarization we're seeing across the world. And we'll hopefully see world leaders starting to think about cooperation rather than an ever intensifying rivalry, which is being fueled by ever greater arms sales.
Pieter, increasing though these numbers are, as you suggest, could they in fact be, the real figures be higher than that? China could be spending much more than it reveals on its military, on research and development, for example. Russia has more spending power. It spends in rubles from its domestic military producing suppliers. So are these figures real, or could they be more?
Figures are, of course, no more than an estimate. They are based on what governments report. They're not necessarily just the same as what governments report about their so-called defense spending. So take a look at China. What we report about Chinese military spending is significantly higher than the budget for the Ministry of Defense in China. And in China, they look upon that with certain question marks. They argue that military spending is not necessarily that high, but we include different types of other spending than just the spending of the Ministry of Defense in our total estimates. Now, of course, then the next question you have is, okay, but what is a dollar worth in China and what is it worth in the US? What can you buy in either state? And of course, it's true that on average, you can buy more for a dollar than you in China than you can buy in the US. And you have to take that into account too. But here we warn that you have to be very careful with using military spending data when you want to understand military capability. The fact that China can spend more for each dollar than the US can doesn't necessarily mean that they really are able to get more, let's say, bang out of each buck than the US does. So our figures are in the first place there to provide a first kind of starting point for a discussion about the impact of military spending on the global economy, on the economy of certain countries, and trying to understand which priorities states make when it comes to their government spending, whether they spend rather on the military or whether they're willing to, as it is now the case, maybe spend more on healthcare or on trying to save their economies.
Adam, China's military budget is famously opaque. Is it spending a lot more than we even think it is? But then, even if it's spending so much more, is it getting value for money out of what it spends?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's certainly questions about the transparency of Chinese military spending, including which items are included and which items are not, as Pieter alluded to. And I think the key point is that this is a contested space, even for for China, for Russia, for the United States. There's certain categories of spending which you or I might consider military applications that are not considered as purely military spending. So I think we have to be aware of that. China's military defense spending has certainly been growing significantly over the last few decades, and that's, as Peter alluded to again, fueled by economic development in China. I think a large part of that goes to salary and personnel costs, which is a big part of defense budget. And as China's wage increases, this is going to put more pressure on the defense budget. So the official figure put that around 28%. It's pretty consistent, fluctuating between 28 to 36%, I think, in recent decades. So wages are getting more expensive, which gives the Chinese military incentive to reduce its force, but at the same time, equipment is costing more and more all the time. In fact, the cost of new technology is skyrocketing in both absolute terms, but also in proportional terms. Also increasing in proportional terms, rather, mainly due to how expensive this new technology is. So I think we just have to be aware of these two factors when considering China's military spending.
Andrew, you touched on the coronavirus just before. There's been a deepening in recent months of mistrust between the US and China because of the origins of the coronavirus. Do you think that's going to lead to more military spending, or will, in the end, the realities of global recession force cutbacks across the board?
I think what we'll see is possibly a short-term dip in military spending, depending on how long the current lockdowns go on for. But I've got no doubt that in the lead up to the election this November, Donald Trump will be trying to make it a China election. And a large part of that will be a focus on ever expanding military powers. And of course, it's illusionary. You can't use a nuclear weapon against a virus. You can't use an aircraft carrier against a virus. And I think what the virus has shown is that actually healthcare is an awful lot more important to well-being than military power is. And my concern is that the direction of travel is the very dangerous one, because it isn't just in China. We're also seeing India, for example, spending increasing amounts as well. And a heavily armed world is not necessarily a safer world. We have to be looking to cut back on the money which is being spent on new and powerful weapons and new ways to kill people, because it hasn't created stability. My concern is, as the US election draws nearer, we're going to see ever more reactionary rhetoric from the White House, and probably see candidates trying to outbid each other to see who can spend more money on weapons, more money on the military. And it creates some very worrying trends looking forward.
Peter, do you also see that only a temporary dip in spending as economic realities bite, and will the US go head-to-head again with China in the run-up to the election, the US election?
As with everything, it's very hard to predict anything right now. But if we just look back some 10 years ago, when we had the financial crisis that led to a very significant economic crisis in certain countries in Europe in particular, those countries did see a temporary dip in their military spending. So between about 2010 and 2014. After that, and these were mainly countries in Central Europe, after that, the perception of threat from Russia increased so much that they also using the economic growth which started again in those countries, they were able then to restart military spending too. And this might be a scenario which we may see also following this pandemic and the economic recession that we will most likely see in an extreme form this year. At the same time, if we look at the reality right now, we also see already now how countries react very differently to the economic recession and all that. We see, for example, that a country like Indonesia has already announced it will cut some of its military spending in 2020 to be able to deal with some of the effects of the pandemic. Whereas, for example, here in Europe, Norway, which also suffers from the pandemic in different ways, including economically, Norway has already announced that despite all this, it is intending to increase its military spending already now and also already in the coming years. So it will be a very diverse picture where some countries will choose for political reasons and even for economic reasons, arguing that the military and arms spending can be part of an economic stimulus package, will argue for at least sustaining or at least increasing military spending, whereas others will clearly say, no, we can't do that right now. We will have to cut, we will have to slow down the increase in military spending that we have seen in recent years.
It might be the case that many countries are forced to reevaluate spending priorities, spending more money on healthcare and social care as a consequence of coronavirus than on defence. Might China be forced to reevaluate its spending priorities too?
Absolutely. Before the outbreak of COVID-19, military spending was already, or at least the increase in military spending was already decreasing, converging towards long-term GDP growth, which this year they targeted at 6%. But given the COVID situation, the growth target, as well as China's military spending in the next year, is potentially significantly affected. But that's likely to be a short-term dip, and I think in the long term military spending will continue to rise, but rising at a rate that's fairly in line, or at least converging towards GDP growth. But just to give some context, China's official defense spending as a percentage of GDP is hovering around 2%. So this is actually low compared to other countries such as US and Russia. What that really means is that if Beijing feels threatened, then it does have the means of ramping up its investment in military capabilities.
Andrew, I want to ask about arms control treaties and the effect they have on military spending. The fact is that they're losing impact, losing influence, arms control treaties. The START treaty needs to be extended by February 2021, next year. There's no indication that Russia or the US are ready to do that. How important are treaties like that to trying to control military spending?
Well, a treaty is only as strong as the political will which it's based on, and the big treaty for that has been the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN-backed Arms Trade Treaty, which has been an incredibly weak piece of legislation with a number of holes which have been exploited quite happily by arms exporting governments. Ultimately, words are easy, rhetoric's incredibly easy, but it is political will which is required, because it's not just military spending which is the problem, it's what those weapons are used for. It's been 17 years now, for example, since the US-led invasion of Iraq, and yet the consequences of it are deadly consequences people are still living with every day in Iraq. It's very easy to talk your way into a war, but very hard to win, maintain and build peace afterwards. What concerns me about a lot of the treaties is that they have proven themselves to be just words, and that when push comes to shove, it is state interests which have been the driving agenda. Russia's military spending growth has coincided with an increasingly aggressive foreign policy, for example. And these do need to be reined in, but they need to be reined in by a political will and a desire to do so. And we do need to see international solutions, but a lot of that has to happen at home as well.
Pieter, are a lack of effective international treaties helping to add to this increase in spending, do you think?
I think that is certainly one thing one can say. I think we can already see how in Europe arms control is no longer very high on the agenda. There are still attempts to come to some sort of arms control, but it is very hard to achieve. And then I talk about the arms control in which, for example, Russia and European states together discuss the number of weapons that they have and how they can deploy them and where they can deploy them and under which conditions they're going to inform each other about that. All these kind of efforts are, of course, a little bit on the back burner, the more so because the Trump administration has also chosen to step away from that kind of multilateralist approach. And I think that in itself will have an effect on military spending, probably post-COVID pandemic and all that. But still, if this continues, if countries cannot come to some sort of agreement, some sort of diplomatic channels in which they discuss the level of armaments they have, in which they try to explain why they have them and try to deal with that, in the best way we can. I think see that there will be a continuing demand and a growing demand on some of the major military spenders in the world, particularly the US, China, Russia, and countries in Europe.
Adam, I suppose there would be no interest, would there, from the Chinese side for any sort of treaties like this? They're already their paucity of nuclear weapons in comparison to the US and Europe would make them hang back from anything like that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly in the nuclear realm, China has significantly less of a nuclear weapons stockpile than both US and China, both the US and Russia rather. So Beijing has made it very clear that it's not interested in trilateral negotiations on nuclear arms control, since it sees itself as in a position where it's significantly weaker than the other two leading nuclear weapons powers, and there's every incentive for China to actually accelerate its nuclear modernization program. So not a priority for Beijing, and certainly not a priority for the Trump White House.
Andrew, do you see a connection between the increase in sort of nationalist rhetoric from many governments, perhaps from the US, from some in Eastern Europe, a little from China, from other parts of the world as well, as a correlation with that increase in military spending?
I do. I think that when we hear more nationalist rhetoric, when we see more nationalist chauvinism on the world stage, I think what that fuels is very often fear. And if there's one industry which thrives on fear, it's the arms industry. It's an industry which is entirely based on the fueling of conflict and the fueling of war and the threat of war and conflict. And when we see governments who are pushing this fear agenda, whether it is fear of China, whether it's fear of Russia, there's also governments who are very pro-military. You don't tend to get nationalist, right-wing populist governments who are taking a less militaristic line. And I think that is very concerning. I think the whole nationalist narrative we're seeing around the world, not just in the US, but beyond as well, has to be very concerning. But this coming US election is going to be a very important one. I don't think that we would see a huge change to foreign policy if the Democrats win, but I think a lot of the negative trends which we're seeing will become exacerbated even more by a Donald Trump presidency in its second term and with even less restraint on it.
Peter, does that suggestion of increased nationalism, nationalist rhetoric in certain countries lead to an increase in military spending? Have you seen that?
I think it's very hard to prove statistically that is necessarily the case, and I think you can also there see very different countries still following similar lines. Yes, it is true that a number of countries in Europe where you see nationalistic voices becoming very important in politics, and that may come with an increase in military spending. But at the same time, it's not necessarily so that the nationalistic voices, for example, are in power in Germany or even here in Sweden. In Sweden, we actually have a social democratic government. And still, despite that, we see that both countries are increasing their military spending significantly in recent years, primarily then again due to what they perceive as a growing potential threat from Russia, on top of a number of other issues that play. So there's always this kind of, on the one hand, there is how different political groups may use the military as kind of a way to enhance their own power as part of their whole narrative. But on the other hand, there are, of course, also security assessment, careful security assessments, which lead to conclusions about how military capacity should be increased because it is believed that military capacity can deal with certain of these issues. Again, in the case of Sweden or Germany, there are clear described security policies related to the threat from Russia or, for example, the threat from IS, which inform the final decision about actually increasing military spending. But yes, of course, and I do agree there, that also the industry has an interest in pushing for higher military spending, and they will do their best as a lobby to influence that and to increase military spending.
Okay, and very quickly, just from you, Adam, in the future, what does China see as a concern for its security, particularly in its part of the world, in the Asia-Pacific region? What is driving China mainly?
Well, I think there are a number of things, but the increasing contentiousness of US-China relations is certainly on Beijing's mind very much, but also a potential Taiwan scenario, as well as certain potential contingencies in the South China Sea, where China has sovereign claims that are disputed by other powers that might bring US power at play. So I think China is planning for a number of scenarios, but Taiwan and South China Sea being on the top of that list.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time again. There's so much more to discuss, but for another day. But thank you for the moment for joining us. That's to Pieter Wezeman, to Adam Nee and to Andrew Smith, and to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for more debate, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.